Fantasy and science fiction are often marketed together. It makes sense considering the two genres require a similar suspension of disbelief, a similar imagination. Yet despite attempts to lump sci-fi and fantasy together, or to play the difference off as insignificant, fans still have a sense that there's a deep distinction between them. I want to talk about that distinction, and how understanding the differences between each of these genres unlocks the power of both. Let's begin by talking about a difference that exists within science fiction. People refer to hard and soft sci-fi in common parlance, and there's a way of separating them from one another superficially. Hard sci-fi is rocket ships and androids. Soft sci-fi is psychic powers and floating rocks. But there's another way of thinking about this, and understanding it comes from understanding how we got here. In an environment where technical progress is mostly confined to information technology, it's easy to forget how impressive new technology was in a society that was rapidly industrializing. Science fiction first started to pick up steam in the late 19th century. This interest was driven by excitement for new things that all of a sudden seemed to be possible. Things no one had imagined before, but were now becoming real before people's very eyes. This spawned materials that were both scientifically plausible and gripping, and where some predictions of these works did in fact come true. However, as soon as people started looking upward and outward, all sorts of fanciful elements began attaching themselves to the genre. Authors began to insert components that were not plausible or just not knowable according to the science of the time. The link to science for these works became more attenuated. This created a rift between works that stuck closer to science and those that used science-tinged backdrops but didn't care much about what might actually be possible. Two subgenres emerged within this one genre, one that was excited to work under the constraints that science provided, and one that was excited not to. This is the actual distinction between hard and soft sci-fi, not the set dressing, but the strength of the link to scientific reality. Hard science fiction writing is an ingenious way to lend realism to some works that otherwise seem very different from the world we live in. Genuine visions of a future, even a distant future, that might one day take shape. Soft science fiction has more latitude to show us worlds of imagination. Storytellers don't need to tie their narratives to set scientific principles. They're able to say what they want to say, mentally and spiritually, without needing to resort as much to the physical world. And if this sounds like something that's starting to veer towards fantasy, that's because it should. Fantasy is what you get when you untether a narrative from physical reality entirely, whereas a linkage between the setting's new rules and the real-world rules becomes more stretched moving from hard to soft sci-fi. In the transition from soft sci-fi to fantasy, the linkage breaks completely. The added rules of a fantasy setting may or may not be internally consistent. Sometimes they're highly internally consistent, but whatever the case, these added rules don't come from the real world, and that's good. If soft science fiction allows an avenue for picking up an idea without bothering about scientific accuracy, then fantasy allows for picking up a concept on its own terms, confronting it directly, and handling it alongside other compelling elements. Fantasy allows for exploring concepts. Fantasy allows for constructing strange and compelling settings, for exploring inner and outer worlds. Obtaining this perspective on science fiction and fantasy gives us insight into the potential of each genre. For example, there's something about science fiction that doesn't get talked about enough, which is that at least some of the things depicted in sci-fi might theoretically occur one day. It's easy to discount this when the things predicted don't transpire, and even easier to forget when they do. You could tell a fantasy story about greed or getting lost in illusions, and it would be just that, a character story about those issues. But a sci-fi story about overharvesting resources in the near future, or about becoming addicted to an all-encompassing realistic simulation, feels more pressing, feels more relevant, because something like this might actually occur. Black Mirror has committed to a kind of hard, low science fiction. Hard in that it focuses on scientifically realistic technology, and low in that it focuses on near-term culture. And it's been able to access a bunch of different topics in this way. Science fiction can highlight matters at the interface of humanity and technology. Science fiction can draw attention to real potential issues from our future. And this isn't just limited to visions of dystopia. Science fiction can depict brighter futures too. Star Trek is actually an example of how science fiction can be powerfully hopeful. If you wrote a bright fantasy story about a party or order of good guys whose whole purpose was to go around doing good things for people, it still wouldn't have the kind of utopian oomph that something like Star Trek has. Because even though the technologies depicted in Star Trek may never come into existence, there's still a sense that some elements of this better world might be possible. In other words, there's a powerful idea at work here that something like Star Trek may actually happen. And that's a fascinating concept. Nor is any of this to discount fantasy. To talk about the power of fantasy, I would actually highlight something more depressing: reality. Reality is often disappointing. But reality can be disappointing in a specific way. Reality can be narratively disappointing. Real life can be a boring story. Even when you try to move into normal fiction, it can be difficult to wriggle out of the narrative constraints that reality provides. Science fiction has a similar issue. You can push to an extent, but remember, sci-fi has some of the same limitations as reality, which was always the point, working from the world we know. With fantasy, there are no such constraints. In a fantasy setting, the entire backdrop can be crafted around ideas. In that kind of a setting, an object like a gem can be fear, or longing, or hope. This can give people the leverage to discuss the types of issues they want to discuss. They can confront personal or psychological issues without the story being dragged away by the humdrum requirements of day-to-day life. Fantasy can provide escape for readers or viewers, but it can also provide strength. It can be a way of working out of different kinds of trauma. It's an important psychological tool going back to the dawn of civilization, and one with significant formulations today. Through it, one can bypass the rules of the world to deal directly with motivations, or create new rules that operate in new and intriguing ways, all in the service of examining character. Understanding the nature of these two genres helps us understand why certain stories work so well. Constraining the imagination to a world of scientific limitations can actually expand human narrative horizons, and removing world-building constraints could show you just how unlimited storytelling can be. These forms are scaffolding for the human imagination, showing the power and potential of storytelling, helping us understand the narratives around us.